Despite being a big Metal Gear / Metal Gear Solid fan, I put off playing Unmetal for a long time. It clearly appeared to be a game heavily inspired by the early Metal Gear games, but I didn't feel a strong urge to play it. Thanks to my Steam Deck and being able to play it without having to stay in a single spot, I recently got around to trying out Unmetal. I'd like to say that it exceeded or met my expectations, but the truth is that I was left with mixed feelings. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed the game, but I felt that the experience wasn't as enjoyable as I thought it would be. While that may be true, there's still a lot about it that stood out to me for positive reasons. Pretty early on, it's clear that Unmetal features great artwork and cutscenes. The actual gameplay is styled after NES graphics, but the cutscenes are more like what you'd expect from later era SNES and the mid-90s in general. I like that a lot because even if I'm not actually playing during cutscenes, I like being able to be entertained in a hands-off kind of way. I'd like to be able to say that it was the same with the voiceover work, but for the most part, I felt that it was over the top and came off more like a parody, especially with Jesse Fox, the character you play as. I eventually realized that was the point, seeing as how despite being influenced by the Metal Gear games, it's a more comedic / parody styled love letter rather than one that may try to be more like a tribute or spiritual successor. I don't think that's a bad thing, but from having experienced all sorts of parodies in various different mediums, I know it's possible to make fun of something while still being able to deliver a well-crafted experience that doesn't feel overdone. That's something I'll eventually get into, largely due to Unmetal frequently falling back on jokes that eventually came off as overused. Once I started playing, I felt that there was too much starting and stopping. It was to the point where all I wanted to do was actually play, and I felt that frequent tutorial moments felt overdone. It's not a bad thing to ease players into your game, but I'm reminded of how some might recommend a game while also saying things like, it's a slow starter, but once X time has passed, the rest of it is good. Some might not mind that, and I'll even go out of my way to say that I've greatly enjoyed games that were slow starters, but it ultimately depends on how the rest of the game turns out. Am I being entertained or drawn in by a game's slow start, or do I feel like I just want to get over whatever's being shown to me, so that I can get to the good stuff? For a certain amount of time, it was the latter when it came to Unmetal. So far, I'd say that I largely haven't spoken well of Unmetal, and chances are that's how the rest of my review will come off, but trust me when I say that I did enjoy most of what it has to offer. I thought it was awesome how your actions ended up affecting cutscenes. For example, there was one instance when I was punching crates way too many times, and this triggered a specific cutscene. I realize how random that sounds, but I did this thanks to the crates offering supplies that I needed throughout the game. Opening up a crate and finding something inside isn't a surprise at all, but it is when that leads to a cutscene being played. I liked that and felt that was one of Unmetal's positives due to feeling that my actions mostly led to good / enjoyable outcomes. It's also worth noting that even when negative ones played out, I was still left thinking, good job with that. One of the reasons why I didn't think as highly of Unmetal as I initially thought I would was due to it being more arcadey than the Metal Gear games. This could be seen all throughout the game for good reasons, such as with the leveling up system and some that I perceived as bad. I thought Unmetal's use of a crafting system was cool, but sometimes it came off as too outside the box. Having to combine items to advance during certain parts of it was fun, but at times it required abstract thinking that I didn't expect at all. Thinking outside of the box in a game isn't a bad thing, but I like to be introduced to moments like that smoothly rather than thrown in unexpectedly. It was great when it was done intuitively, but there were times where had I not looked up a solution online, it would have taken too much time to figure out, or I straight up wouldn't have figured things out on my own. A specific example of this was during a heavily scripted moment where I needed to sneak into the base. The solution ended up being using a fire extinguisher and a thrown out pizza box to give off the impression that I was delivering a steamy box of pizza into the base. I could see that being a better fit with a carton of cigarettes and the pizza box, but a fire extinguisher just doesn't fit into that equation for me. This left me thinking that these scripted moments were too precise, and at times they ended up feeling more like a quiz. At times it was clear that I was doing something wrong and I could figure out what the solution was, but other times it seemed like it was the game's fault. It's because of how smoothly some of the cutscenes / scripted moments went ahead despite having done something wrong. This led to multiple moments of frustration, and like I mentioned, having to use guides to figure out what I was doing wrong. It's possible that Unmetal could have done a better job with this, mainly by offering a tip of some sort that would state, unexpected outcomes can be prevented with more careful thought, but that might be too on the target. The point isn't for me to be given the solution, but at the same time, things could have flowed better with a slight push in the right direction. It's kind of like in Resident Evil 1 when you try to go out the front door. It's possible to do so, but the cutscene with the dogs being triggered and eventually being told that it's too dangerous to go outside is a great way of showing this isn't the right way to approach the situation. While this bothered me more times than I thought it would, there were mini missions that I enjoyed because their solutions were clearer than with others. For example, finding a radio and eventually a circuit to make it encrypted. Figuring out where to look for the circuit was handled well because at this point, it was clear that it was possible to destroy objects and that some would reward you with supplies/key items. This was done in a structured way that made sense to me, so I could focus on the overall fun of what was being asked of me, rather than how to make sense of a problem. Taking a quick glance at Unmetal might give you the impression that it could offer limited gameplay, but that's not true at all. It offered varied gameplay, and this was especially noticeable with the eventual mini subsection, and hovercraft/boat ones as well. I like this kind of gameplay because even if they might seem out of place in an actual Metal Gear game, they fit into the overall nature of the game, and they were well crafted. If they had been boring or wildly out of context, I could see myself thinking that they were shoehorned in, but that wasn't the case at all. This was also seen with Unmetal's approach to boss fights. I thought it was interesting how most boss fights appeared to offer unique experiences that differed from what the general game had to offer. It's not a surprise at all, seeing as how Unmetal is clearly inspired by the Metal Gear franchise, but it went beyond something like having to use XYZ objects/weapons in order to advance. There were multiple instances of something like this, but one boss fight that stood out resembled a breakout kind of game. Not only did these boss fights keep me on my toes due to the different experiences they had to offer, but also because they were harder than I expected. It wasn't to the point that I was rage quitting as if I were playing a Soulsborne game. It was the kind of challenge that forced me to be more attentive and generally fit right in with what the game was offering. Alongside being harder than I expected, Unmetal was also funnier than I thought it would be. At first, this was something that I appreciated because of the entertainment this part of Unmetal had to offer. There were moments like Fox not wanting to explain how he managed to get a noose, or when a Benny Hill theme music ripoff started to play during a sewer rat chase scene. This also spilled over into how you could approach conversations. At times I selected what appeared to be the most outlandish thing to say just to see what Fox would end up saying. That felt like humor done right to me because it was unexpected, but also managed to nail the landing. I wish I could say that was the case for all of Unmetal, but then I'd be lying. It eventually got to the point where I felt that some of the humor was overused. Unmetal was longer than I thought it would be, simply because there was much more to it, but also because the humor being overdone contributed to the game feeling longer than it was. It's like being in an organic chemistry class that's being taught by a boring professor. I find it hard to believe that someone out there thinks that organic chemistry is fun, but the delivery of a material really depends on the person/thing that's delivering it. Unmetal largely being a parody of Metal Gear helps make it stand out, so I can understand why the humor was used so heavily, but that still doesn't change how often it would fall back on some jokes. Now that I think about it, some of them felt like inside jokes meant to be understood by a small number of people, rather than jokes that were funny and eventually delivered. An example of this is how the guards in most of the game are named Mike. Simply making it so that most guards are named Mike isn't funny. What's funny to me is when one of them happened to be named Mike Hunt. That's funny because the meaning of the joke is clear. When a joke has no explanation, is overused, and isn't funny in the first place, that's when I find reason to complain. I could see someone saying something like, sophomoric humor isn't that big of a deal, but it is when it's a large part of a game's identity. It also didn't help with the initial expectations I had of Unmetal. I was hoping it would be more of a serious love letter to the NES Metal Gear games. That's most of what it is, but the story isn't on the same level, and the overused humor also doesn't help. It's like having a friend that keeps bringing up a specific story/joke because it got everyone to laugh at one point in time. Nostalgia can help an old joke be funnier than it is, especially when it's told more than once, but there comes a time where you're thinking, is that all you got to fall back on? Chances are that I'm focusing too much on what isn't that big of a deal, but I once again go back to the point being that Unmetal can be seen as a parody/comedic game. I can understand letting something slide if it's a small part of a game/whichever medium comes to mind, but when it's a large piece, that's when I'm left expecting more and thinking less of something when a decent part of it just isn't delivering the goods. By this point, it's clear that I didn't think as highly of Unmetal as I have of other games. While that's the case, it's also true that I still enjoyed most of what Unmetal has to offer. If anything, it would come off as better than it does if some of the fat had been trimmed off. It didn't have to be as long as it did, and it didn't need to rely on humor as much as it did in order to come off as entertaining. I realize that makes it sound like I want Unmetal to be something that it didn't end up as, but I'd say the truth is somewhere in the middle. To say that Unmetal is a niche game would be an understatement. It's a game that can be played by most, as is the same with a decent number of games that are available to be played, but whether or not it's enjoyed depends on a lot. The target audience is clearly Metal Gear fans. While that's largely the case, that audience starts to be whittled down by whether or not they want to play a game that makes great use of humor to deliver its experience. I don't mind playing a comedic game at all. I mind when the comedy doesn't deliver the goods, and that's the case with a decent part of Unmetal. I don't regret having played Unmetal at all, but had I known what I know about it now, chances are that I would have passed on playing it. It reminds me of albums that I can listen to yet leave me thinking I don't need/want to listen to it again. It's not because it's terrible, but because it's not as good as I was hoping it would be. That's the case with Unmetal, and for that reason I think of it as a different kind of one and done type of game. I don't think it'll be enjoyed by the general audience, but as I usually say, if you've liked what you've seen or heard about Unmetal, feel free to give it a try. How do you feel about comedic games? Do you think that puzzles/gameplay need to be understandable without needing too much explanation? What are some games that you've played and didn't fully enjoy? If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching.